Welcome to The Author Show, where we feature new authors and books, from fiction to self-help and everything in between. You'll find it all at theauthorshow.com. That's theauthorshow.com. And now let the show begin.
Hi, this is Linda Thompson, your host for The Author Show. Today, we are visiting with Marshall O'Neillon, who is a professor of physics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. O'Neillon is a prolific writer who has published over 180 reference journal articles, but we're going to talk about God's Chosen, Renaissance, Book 1. Where Were You When the Lights Went On? That's his first full-length book. Dr. O'Neillon, welcome to The Author Show.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Marshall, will you give us a quick overview of God's Chosen, Renaissance?
Sure. It's about Jews, Judaism, and what they've done for humanity, that is, for the rest of us. I'm not Jewish, so for me this is a great surprise, just how much Jews and Judaism have done for me and for everyone. That's what the book's about. It's a series of stories.
Your co-author, David Ramadi, has been a guest on our show. How did this writing partnership come about?
We were introduced through a mutual friend, one of David's former high school teachers, Stephen Fortney. We met when I was on a sabbatical in Israel before my first wife died of breast cancer. We became friends. We decided to try to work together, and it worked out.
While you were writing your book, did you have any particular type of reader in mind?
I do, and I think David does. We're interested in people who are interested in ideas, who want to understand how in the world it could be that with all the persecution, Jews and Judaism are still with us, when all the societies of their time are just history notes, gone, forgotten.
How would you describe your writing style? Are you teaching a class, telling a story, or perhaps a combination of the two?
It's almost entirely telling stories. What we're trying to do is give the reader the fun of the, oh, I didn't know that experience many times, because that was my experience. Coming at this from just a general knowledge of Jews and Judaism, I got this, I didn't know that a lot. And I want to give the reader the same experience.
In the information that you sent in, you say that Jews contributed disproportionately to the Islamic Golden Age. At one time, the two peoples seem to have lived in a state of cooperation. What happened to change that?
Two things happened. Number one, the Golden Age of Islam ended, and a much more what they call fundamentalist group took over as the ideas people in Islam. And they've been running that show ever since. Because of the lack of tolerance, Jews increasingly found themselves not just second class, but worse citizens, few opportunities, more persecution. No surprise, they didn't contribute as much.
You also wrote that the Jews mandated literacy for all male Jews at a time when the large majority of Christians were not literate. What were their views on women, and why leave them uneducated?
That was a surprise to me. I expected Jews to be just as, sexist as everybody else of that time, and that wasn't so. There were Jews who were war leaders, presidents of the country, prophets, at a time when the surrounding societies treated women as property. I didn't mean to say that Jews forbid women to be literate, merely that they required men to be literate. So there, in fact, was much more impact of women in Judaism, even after Christ, than in the contemporaneous Muslim and Christian societies.
Interesting. Well, speaking of education, where did the Muslims fit in? Were they educated or were they not?
Largely not. That was why Jews did so well during the Golden Age. Here you had a small group, not allied with the Christians, and at the same time well-educated, with an international business network of co-religionists to draw on, and willing to be loyal if they were treated well. That worked out.
The subtitle of your book is Where Were You When the Lights Went On? Will you explain the meaning behind your title and subtitle?
It goes to our first chapter. Every society that's ever been has a creation story. Christianity does, Islam does, Judaism does. We spend the first chapter talking about the comparison between current 21st century physics cosmology and these three creation stories. To me, this was a tremendous surprise how close the Jewish creation story is to contemporaneous current physics thinking, and how qualitatively different it is compared to the Christian and the Muslim creation stories.
Your title also indicates that you might be writing a series. Am I correct? And if so, how many books do you have planned?
We have 3 books planned. The first one is the one we're talking about. That goes up to the American Revolution. The second goes from the American Revolution to just after World War I. The last goes from World War I to today, with 3 predictions for the future as well.
Okay, we're talking to a certain extent about religion, but we are also talking about ethnicity and basic ways of life. So are you, in your book, sharing the history of religion, or are you sharing history as the global sense of the word?
The global sense of the word. Basically, there's very little straight-up religion or religious doctrine in our book. It's more about the culture of people. And speaking of which, I started getting interested in this topic when I was on that sabbatical in Israel. I would go to a bus stop in Israel and watch people, and I watched every type of human being there is walk by me. I would go to the Palestinian areas in the West Bank and do the same thing, and the variety of people was tremendously less. The physical variety of people was tremendously less. And I wondered how this could be, because these 2 groups of people literally live right next door to each other. That got me started thinking about what makes Jews and Judaism special.
I'd like you to expand on that a little bit more. Why is it so different when they are next door to one another?
I think there are several reasons. Number one, most Jews have had ancestors who've lived outside of what is now Israel. That's, in fact, a very large majority. Because of that, they have dealt with, adapted to many, many different cultures. Thousands of years they've been kicked out from Israel since the Romans burned the temple in 72 A.D. By contrast, the people who are now mostly Muslim in the West Bank area at one time were Christian, entirely Christian, and have not had any contact with other parts of the world. Therefore, they've remained a small and pretty much homogeneous group. By contrast to that, Jews have very much had experience with all sorts of people, from Britain to China, and they've adapted and they've incorporated within Judaism Jews of many different ethnic groups. I really wasn't kidding. I saw Cambodian Jews and Chinese Jews and African Jews walk by these bus stations, and I was just watching and wondering, what the heck? Where did all these people come from?
So we're talking about a real mixed bag there, right?
Completely mixed bag. United Nations mixed bag.
Wow, very interesting. Did you have the opportunity to talk to, like, a Cambodian Jew and find out why they were in Israel?
A few. The problem is I don't speak Hebrew, and the language barrier is substantial. But I did speak with the ones who knew at least some English, and fundamentally they were there either because of religious reasons or because they were visiting family. And the families were there for religious reasons.
Interesting. If you could compare your book with any other, what would that other book be?
Max Demont's History of Jews. It is a history, whereas ours is a series of stories. But when I was teaching myself, which I had to do for 2 years before I could even start thinking about writing, that was the number one book that I found the most valuable. Max Demont is a wonderful writer, and I learned a tremendous amount from him.
If you had to choose, what is the single most important idea you want to share with readers of God's Chosen?
The Jews figured out a way to make a culture that could survive as a culture when they were spread across a distance from England to China. And most of the people in that culture would never see each other face-to-face in their entire lives. How do you keep the culture when that happens? That they figured out how to do. To me, that's remarkable.
I definitely agree. So tell me, do you believe there will ever come a time when the three religions can get along, where the radicals on all sides will cease to have influence over the masses?
I mentioned at the beginning that we have three predictions in Book 3. One of the three, which I understand a lot of people would regard as unlikely, is that Judaism and Islam will reconcile. And the reason is that the belief systems in many, many ways are very similar. For many centuries after the Prophet Muhammad wrote the Quran, Muslims had to contend with the skepticism of other people saying, well, this sounds like Judaism. You're just another kind of Jew. By contrast, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is more substantial. It's not obvious to me that that can be reconciled.
Where can we learn more about you, about your work, and most of all, where can we purchase God's Chosen Renaissance Book 1, Where Were You When the Lights Went On?
You can purchase it from any bookstore or from the usual wholesalers such as Barnes & Noble. As far as learning more about David and myself, David has a website, davidramadi.com, and in there we even have excerpts from the book so that people can stick their toes in the water to see if they like how it feels before spending any money.
That's not a bad idea. Marshall, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today. You've written a book that a lot of our listeners are going to want to read, and I'm one of them. When you and David publish Book 2, will you come back and chat with us again?
It would be my pleasure. This is the sort of thing that doesn't come naturally to me. Physicists are notoriously introverts, but it's something that people do, and they appreciate the information, so I'm willing to do it. You take care, okay?
Here's a review I found for God's Chosen that is the perfect way to close our show today. There are hundreds of books written on this subject, and I've read at least 100. When I read this, I was spellbound and could hardly wait to read it all. These authors have written from a different point of view than most. Their literary style makes the reader feel like they are on a journey. One of the most enlightened and enlightening books I've read. In my opinion, this trilogy will become a classic and will have a very long life in literature. Thank you for listening to us today. Please visit theauthorshow.com to listen to other featured authors. These interviews are available to book buyers worldwide on demand every day, 24/7. And for those of you who like audiobooks, please check out our audiobook store at theaudiobookmark.com. If you have written a book and would like to be a guest on the show, visit theauthorshow.com, complete the interview request form, and we will contact you shortly thereafter. The Authors Show is a great way to market your book by getting in front of your target audience with a high-quality interview that will make a real impact. Please visit us again as we continue to bring you great books and interesting authors on The Authors Show.
Thanks for listening to The Authors Show. Find out more about authors and their work at theauthorshow.com. theauthorshow.com. Tune in next time to another great author on The Authors Show.